Good morning, Bridgeway Church. It is so great to greet you from the Holy Land, Israel. We wish that you were all here. We've just been having an incredible time. We want to say thank you, first off, for praying for us. You've been praying for us this entire time that we've been gone. We've seen some of the great sights. We've been to Nazareth. We've been to Capernaum. We've seen the Sea of Galilee. And there's lots more ahead. Later today, we'll be in the Jordan River being baptized, and it's just been an incredible trip. I want to say, for those of you that thought about coming and you didn't make it, when we come again, you're going to want to be here with us. It is an incredible experience, an incredible trip, and we'd love to have you be a part of us. We're thrilled that you're with us today there at Bridgeway, and I want you to grab your sermon notes. I want you to grab your Bible, because we're going to jump straight in. Today we're looking at the Sea of Galilee behind me. We're actually at the hotel. It's early. We woke up early for a sunrise. Had a little bit of rain, so we have a little bit of an overcast behind us, but it's still beautiful nonetheless. And the Sea of Galilee was the location of so many teachings, so many encounters from the Lord. And we're actually going to look at two this morning and how they can relate to our lives as well. So if you have your Bible, if you have your sermon notes, we're looking at Mark chapter 4. And in Mark chapter 4, verse 33, Jesus had been talking with the disciples. He had been using several parables. And the Bible tells us in Mark chapter 4, verse 33, Jesus used many similar stories and illustrations to teach the people as much as they could understand. In fact, in his public ministry, he never taught without using parables. But afterward, when he was alone with his disciples, he explained everything to them. Now, what happens from that statement is they're going to go on a boat ride, so to say. It's going to be traveling to the other side. But I want you to take that first part where he says, where it says that he taught with parables, he taught with stories. There's parallels to things that occur that we can play into our own lives. And you're going to do that today. Because what continues in verse 35, it says this, that day when evening came, he said to his disciples, "Let us go to the other side." Now let's stop right there for just a second. When you think about the other side, for your life and my life, the other side could represent so many different things. The other side could represent a challenge that you're facing. The other side could be you have a promise from the Lord and you're trying to get into the fulfillment of that. The other side could be God's calling on your life to start a ministry, and yet there's a period of time in which it seems to be inactive and you're not walking in it yet. The other side could be you're praying for somebody to come to know the Lord, but there's a real gap of time between them, you praying for them, and them coming to know. And the other side sometimes can be very elusive for us. For the disciples, they're told they're going to go to the other side, and that's going to start this process. Before we read any further, I want you to write in your notes. You have your sermon notes. I want you to write this, where it says, key truth for today. I want you to write, by God's grace, I will make it through this. That's our key truth for today. By God's grace, I will make it through this. In fact, right where you are, and even here today, I want you to say that with me. By God's grace, I will make it through this. And that's important for us, because if we're talking about a setback, maybe you've had a financial setback or relational setback, by God's grace, I'll make it through this. Maybe it's one of the big ALs, the physical, financial, spiritual, relational, and it's been challenging. And you need to know today, maybe you're there at Bridgeway, and you need to know that by God's grace, you're going to get through this. I want you to see that on your notes. By God's grace, I will make it through this. Now, it continues on in verse 35. That day when evening came, he said to his disciples, "Let us go to the other side." Verse 36 says, leaving the crowd behind, they took him along just as he was in the boat. There were also other boats with him. Now, let me pause for just a second. What we have before we get to that point, in Mark chapter 1, Jesus has healed a man with leprosy. He tells him to be quiet. He says to him not to go tell everyone and not to broadcast who he is and that he's the Messiah. But the guy does it anyway. And Jesus has to divert his ministry, and he's going to divert his ministry to these waters. He's going to divert his ministry to the Sea of Galilee area. Chapter 2, he begins teaching by the lake. He begins to carry on that ministry at the very waters that we're looking at right now. And he finds himself in Capernaum. Now, we were there in Capernaum yesterday. Beautiful, beautiful town. You're going to want to come with us next time to be there. It's on the western side of the Sea of Galilee. And he's telling them that they're going to go to the other side. Now, we have an incredible tour guide named David. And David was telling us the other day about the winds that happen here. In the summertime, from around 11 a.m. to later at night, the winds come from the west to the east, and he talked about how when they were younger, they could take a raft and even a sheet, and the winds would literally take them all the way to the other side. So those winds are common, and the winds are going to come up, and the winds are going to be really, really challenging for the disciples in the boat. And you think about something. Sometimes when the Lord tells you to do something, you have an outplaying in your mind of how that's going to look, how it's going to play out. And sometimes it works that way. For them, they anticipated, we're going to go to the other side. Should be pretty simple. Problem is, it's not going to play out exactly how they thought. You ever had anything happen where you're like, this did not work out how I thought it was going to happen? Back home, right? Where you feel like the Lord directed you, commanded you, told you to do something, and it just simply didn't work out how you thought it was going to happen. Well, the disciples are going to be in that context. They think, A, we're taking a boat ride. They have no idea that, B, we're about to be fighting for our lives. And so that's what plays out. Let's look. It says in verse 37, a furious squall came up, and the waves broke over the boat so that it was nearly swamped. Jesus was in the stern, sleeping on a cushion. The disciples woke him and said to him, Teacher, don't you care if we drown? Now let's pause right there for just a second. Back home, you're going to see a word come up on the screen, a word that is used here for teacher, because the disciples called him didaskalos, and they use a term about teacher. It's my opinion on where these guys are and from their response that they were not quite at a point of recognizing him as Messiah. Recognizing him as teacher, recognizing him as sent from God, but not quite at the point of understanding who he was going to say he was. Some of that I take from their reactions from what he would do. Some of that I take from their reactions from what he would say. And we're going to see in just a moment some of their reactions to this situation. So they believe he's a teacher. They believe he's sent from God. He's highly anointed, but not quite yet ready to confirm him as the one. It continues on in verse 39. It says, He got up, rebuked the wind, said to the waves, Quiet, be still. Then the wind died down, and it was completely calm. He said to his disciples, Why are you so afraid? Do you still have no faith? And sometimes people anchor into that, do you still have no faith, and think that this is a condescending statement as though it's read, Why are you so afraid? Do you still have no faith? I don't know that that's entirely what was happening. In my opinion, I think the Lord was far more compassionate and gracious in this. Why are you so afraid? Do you still have no faith? Maybe today you're caught in a storm, and maybe you feel like the Lord's looking at what you're going through and your reactions to it, and you're trying to make sense of it all, and you're beating yourself up thinking that he's ready to chastise you. And I don't know that that's entirely accurate. Sometimes I think he comes next to us and says, Don't be afraid. Have faith. It continues on. They were terrified, and they asked each other, Who is this? Even the winds and the waves obey him. Now, let me just push on to one thing, because this is true for us and it's true for you that back home. That their experience was unique to them. None of us will experience exactly what they experienced in that encounter. but their feelings are somewhat universal. Their experience was unique, but the feelings can be felt by all of us. Where you thought something was going to happen in a predictable way, and it didn't. Where you thought that I was following the Lord and going to end up in this particular location or with this particular person, or that things would play out in this particular way, and somewhere along the lines, something that seemed very natural, something very common, caused a storm for us, and it caused me to fear how I would get through this. How I would get through this sickness, how I would get through this financial collapse, how I would get through this relational collapse. The feelings can be universal for us all. And it's a challenge. It's a challenge when we feel as though, and maybe you can identify, where you feel that you did what was asked of you and it didn't work out. That's something that's really challenging at times, where I feel like, Lord, I did what I felt I was supposed to, what you were directing me to, and for some reason, it's not working. And maybe you're there at Bridgeway today, and maybe you've asked this question. This is a question I can't even begin to tell you how many times I've heard it in counseling or one-on-one conversations, where the question is, what am I doing wrong? Maybe you're asking that question of yourself today, what am I doing wrong? And I think sometimes that comes from not understanding exactly how God uses the in-between, and how God uses the lake, the Sea of Galilee in your life, so to say. I want you to keep that thought, because we're going to go to the next one. If we fast forward 2 chapters, we're going to see a similar situation start to unfold. This time, the disciples did not want to go. They didn't want to go. What had happened before that is the disciples had been sent out to preach. They'd been paired up and they'd been sent out to preach. And they had followed, they had come back to Jesus. And in coming back to the Lord, many people followed. And there's a great gathering starts to assemble around Jesus and the disciples. Jesus wants to be with the disciples in kind of a solitary environment. He says, let us sneak away, basically. So they're going to get in the boat and they're going to try and go to a solitary place. However, the people are going to follow them. Now, what's going to follow that is the people arrive at where Jesus and the disciples were. This is where we're going to have the story of the feeding of the 5,000. Now, you guys don't know this, but we were there yesterday. We were at Tampa. I don't think I'm saying that right, but it's Tampa or something to that extent. But we were there, and what what follows that feeding of the 5,000 is that Jesus is going to tell the disciples that it's time to go, and he's going to commission them to get in the boat, to go back into the Sea of Galilee, but he's not going to join them. Now think about that. You ever been in a situation where the Lord has said, I want you to go, and I'll come later, but I'm not going with you right now? The disciples, I feel, did not want to go. So we're picking up here in Mark chapter 6. It says, immediately Jesus made his disciples get into the boat and go on ahead of them to Bethsaida, while he dismissed the crowd. Now, once again, there at Bridgeway, you're going to see an image come up on the screen with a word that was the Greek term for made. And you'll see that this term actually was a forcible term. It wasn't a term that was just simply asked. It was the kind of term that necessitated, compelling, almost by force. Okay, so we have parents here, we have plenty of parents there. Have you ever had to force your kids to eat vegetables? Have you ever had to force them to go to bed? That carries some of the kind of context or concept that there was going to be this intentional, I'm having to direct you and having to make you. Now, you weren't a part of it there at Bridgeway, but we were a part of it. The other day, Pastor Micah shared with us a devotion, and he referenced and pushed on the nevertheless concept. And that idea of nevertheless, that we're going to serve the Lord, nevertheless, no matter what may come, no matter what the instruction may be told to us, Nevertheless, we're going to follow the Lord. And this is kind of a nevertheless moment for the disciples. They're being told to do something they don't want to do. Now, let me ask you a question. Have you ever been told to do something by the Lord, and in your mind, not like the first one where you think it's going to go well and it didn't, in your mind you're thinking, this is not going to go well, and you end up being right? That's what ends up playing out here. Okay, so look at verse 46. After leaving them, he went up on a mountainside to pray. When evening came, the boat was in the middle of the lake, and he was alone on the land. He saw the disciples straining at the oars because the wind was against them. The wind was against them. They're straining at the oars. And I just imagine, I was thinking about this even last night. I was just thinking, having been here, right here at the sea, it was out on these waters, and thinking, they're out there straining. I knew this wasn't going to work. We shouldn't have gone. Should have listened to us. I just think about that reality that sometimes we can find ourselves. I knew this move to Tampa wasn't going to work. I knew this wasn't the job for me to take. I knew this wasn't the relationship I should have gotten in. I knew this wasn't going to work out this right way. Knew I should have never started that ministry. The disciples are straining, and it continues. About the fourth watch of night, he went out to them, walking on the lake. He was about to pass by them. I've always loved that. He's just going to walk right by them. See you guys. Verse 49, but when they saw him walking on the lake, they thought he was a ghost. They cried out because they all saw him and were terrified. Immediately he spoke to them and said, take courage, it is I, don't be afraid. Now, I don't know about you, but if he comes walking on the water, then that statement where he says, take courage, don't be afraid, would make all kinds of sense. Because none of us have ever witnessed something to that dynamic. None of us have ever witnessed anything that supernatural. And I think, my opinion, I think the disciples were starting progressively to come to an aha moment of who he really was. And I've been with people at times who have come to an aha moment with the Lord as to who he is. And there's both joy in there, and there's also such an overwhelming reverence that it can almost be intimidating when you start to have an aha moment that he is the Lord. And I think the disciples are in the midst of that. And he comes before them and says, don't be afraid, for it's me. Now it says in verse 51, then he climbed into the boat with them. The wind died down. They were completely amazed, for they had not understood about the loaves. That's the feeding of the 5,000 before. Their hearts were hardened. There's lots that could be talked about there, but two more verses. Verse 53, when they had crossed over, they landed at Gennesaret and anchored there. As soon as they got out of the boat, people recognized Jesus. Now, I want you to think about this. This for me is an interesting thing. You have, on one occasion, this going across to the other side. And they thought, easy boat ride, and it gets a little chaotic. They fear for their lives. And Jesus has to calm the scenario. He calms winds, he calms waves, he calms them. He has the feeding of the 5,000, to which they weren't really in tune with what he was doing and how he was going to do that. Then you have this walking on the water scenario. I'm just gripped by the reality that when they get off the boat, he doesn't fire them all. He doesn't I'm getting rid of you jokers. You didn't believe me by this point. What you see from that point forward is the continuation of ministry. For you back home, you need to know that there are times in your relationship with the Lord where you might struggle, where you might feel like you're out there at the sea and you're rowing. I'm trying to get to the other side. I'm trying to get through this situation. And sometimes you're asking yourself the question, What am I doing wrong here? What's going on with this? And sometimes we feel when we get to the other side, when we get to where he's taken us, that he's going to be done with us, that he's going to say, enough of that. Yeah, you should have believed me more. You should have followed me more. And yet we see the ministry of Jesus continue from that point forward, and he does not get rid of them. For me, that's very, very encouraging. Why? Because by God's grace, I'll make it through this. For us today, by God's grace, we'll make it through. You're here in Israel. You're enjoying everything we talked about from summer on. But yet you also have a life back home that you're going to go back to. Possibly the same bills, possibly some of the same challenges, possibly some of the same scenarios. And I would encourage you here today, by God's grace, you're going to get through it. Whatever it is that you're carrying back home, he's going to carry you through that. I love you guys and wish I was there with you. But back home, whatever you're facing, by God's grace, he's going to get you through this. You're not going to be overwhelmed and you're not going to be undone. Just like with the disciples, there are both situations that play out in our lives. Times that we expect it to occur one way and it doesn't. And then there's also seasons and times that we expect it to go one way and it does go that way. But through it all, he is faithful. And sometimes we go from one season to the next season. Sometimes we go from being single to being married. And there's an in-between time. There's a trying to get to the other side. Sometimes somebody goes from being married to single. And there's an in-between time, trying to make it to the other side. Sometimes families go from just being married and no kids to we have kids. Sometimes they go from kids to empty home. Sometimes we go from being certain to uncertain. Sometimes we go from being active to finally being inactive and nothing going on. And sometimes there's a sea in between. It can be very challenging. I just would encourage you today that by God's grace, you're going to get through this. For us today, we're going to get through this. And you think about, for whatever people deal with, whatever their other side is, what's at play is 3 locations. The first location is where you were. The third location is where you're going. The second location is where you get stuck. The second location is where you find yourself a lot of times. That could be so challenging for us. I was thinking about this the other day, and I was talking with somebody that so often in our world, and you'll resonate back home with this, so often we are informed by highlights, right? We're informed by highlights on the news. When we read the scriptures, we're informed often by the highlights. And you look at social media and people post the highlights. But we live in real time. We don't live in highlights. In the scriptures, you'll see the story of somebody, and you'll see the highlight of a moment and the highlight of an encounter. But they lived in real time. They probably had families, and they had to wake up, and they had to go to bed, and they had to eat, and they had all the challenges of real-time life. Like for those of you back home that maybe have been following along with our trip on social media, some of you have seen the photos already, and you're like, man, Israel looks incredible. We've been showing the highlights. You flew on that plane here in real time. That plane ride was real time. The baby crying, no food at points, knees up in your chest. You're like, the highlight looks beautiful on your social media, but you live in real time. And the Lord will give you a word on what's going to happen in your life. And you'll get to that. And those are highlights. But sometimes you live in real time. And you still got to work your job. And you still got to take the kids to the school. And you still got to plow the ground. And you still got to keep showing up. Some of you there, you know what I'm talking about. God's given you a picture of what you're headed to. You've come into relationship with him. And you've got beautiful highlights. If anybody were to hear your story, it would be incredible. But you live in real time. And in real time, you get tired. And in real time, you can get discouraged. And in real time, you can kind of start to lose your conviction about those things that you hold so deeply in highlights. And I would encourage you and remind you, by God's grace, you're going to make it through this. Whatever it is, if he said we're going to the other side, then I'm telling you, you're going to get to the other side. I just want to give you 4 quick boating tips. Because as we think about the disciples that were in both scenarios, one of the very basic surface things that they did that we all need to do, that we need to do, and as simple as this comes, you guys know I'm a very practical guy, the simplicity of you need to stay in the boat. Just stay in the boat. Sometimes we want to get out of the boat. We want to find a new boat. We want to find a new destination. We want to find a new instruction. We want to find something different. But if God has told you to head towards something, if God has given you instruction, a command, a plan for your life, then stay in that boat. And 4 boating tips for staying in the boat, just very simply. Number 1, don't romanticize where you used to be. Don't romanticize where you used to be. It's so easy to romanticize where we were, that it was so much better there. It was so much easier there. You know, one of the things that y'all have heard me before say back home, and you guys have heard me talk about this before, about the children of Israel. When Moses leads them out of Egypt, they cross into what was commonly defined or projected as the promised land. And they don't have the food that they want. They didn't have the water that they wanted. So they're asking Moses and they're complaining. And I've said before that they kind of got amnesia about where they had been through. Like for instance, in Exodus chapter 16, it says this. In Exodus 16, it says in verse 2, there too the whole community of Israel complained about Moses and Aaron. If only the Lord had killed us back in Egypt, they moaned. There we sat around pots filled with meat and ate all the bread we wanted. But now you've brought us into this wilderness to starve us all to death. Sometimes you can forget where you came from because that had not been their reality. It might have been their ancestors' reality, but it was not their reality. They're the ones that were crying out to God, deliver us from this bondage. Deliver us from this Egyptian slavery. We can all do that at times. We can romanticize where we were. It was so much better. It was so much easier. It was so much more appealing. When you're in the middle of the lake, where you came from can be romanticized. And I would encourage you, don't romanticize where you've come from or where you used to be. Be confident where the Lord's leading you. I'll give you one verse. You don't have to flip there. You can just jot it down. Galatians chapter 6 verse 9 says, let us not become weary in doing good, for at the proper time we will reap a harvest if we do not give up. I don't know for you here, I don't know for any of us what the proper time is for when God gets us somewhere. For you back home, I don't know exactly what the proper time is. Last night I was thinking about this. I was thinking about in Scripture, when there's an instruction about departure, often you can nail down some timing. It follows a meal, or it follows a day, or it's at sunrise, or it's at sunset. Sometimes you can nail down some of the timing to the departure. Sometimes you can nail down some of the timing of the struggle. But you know, it's interesting. You almost never get timing to the arrival. You almost never get timing as to when they finally arrived. It just simply says they arrived. You know, for us, when will we arrive? When will you have that breakthrough? I don't know. But the Scripture says in the proper time. If you're back home and you're waiting on the timing of the Lord, I don't know exactly when it'll happen, but I'm telling you that the Scripture confirms to you there's a proper time. So be of good courage. By God's grace, you're going to get through this. The second thing in your notes, you can fill this in. You guys have sermon notes. Don't fight against the people pulling you back in the boat. When people are trying to pull you back in the boat, don't push at them and slap their hands away. Now I'm getting out of this boat. Tired of being in this storm. Don't fight those that love you. Don't fight those that are praying for you. Don't fight those that are trying to rally and see God's purposes come to fruition in your life. Don't resist that. Don't pull against the people. Don't pull against those who are trying to pull you back in the boat. I'll give you a third tip. Resist feeling entitled to an explanation from God. That's an important one. It's an important one for all of us. It's to resist feeling entitled to an explanation from the Lord. He doesn't have to give us an explanation as to why we're in the sea. He doesn't have to give us an explanation as to why we haven't gotten to the other side yet. He doesn't have to give us an explanation to the timing. What he does offer us is his presence. He does offer us his name. He does offer us his grace. Paul would say that he prayed about this thorn in the flesh, but he said, that God had communicated back to him and said, I'm not going to take it away, but my grace is sufficient. He says, in your weakness, my strength is made perfect. I was thinking about this. Last night. In reflecting on these waters, it's becoming more and more clear that on 2 occasions that we have recorded, the disciples struggled out on those waters. And they struggled in the boat together. And on 2 occasions that we have record of, they feared for their lives out on those waters. One thought would be a simple boat ride, and it wasn't. Another, in my opinion, didn't want to go, and it kind of played out how they may have thought it would play out. But on these waters, a group of guys struggled for their lives. Now, you follow me on this. When you're with a group of people and you have that kind of situation, there's no getting around it. There's a bond, there's a unity that is created that you can't create in any other context. There's no getting around the fact that the ministry in which Jesus pulled these disciples together, it was a young ministry. We know of 3 years, and they were at the front part of this ministry. We know the history that all of these disciples would be called to go into various parts of the world after the resurrection. We know that they would go and they would give their lives in the stripes of martyrdom. We know that all of them except for John would die in that way. What would give them such resolve? What would give them such conviction? What would give them that ability to stand strong when they would have opted out? I think, and was thinking about this last night, some of the struggle that happened in the boat out on this sea may have bonded them together. There's no getting around this for the group here. There's a bond that is created from traveling together. And if something were to happen that was scary for all of us, there would be no getting around how we would bond together. And there would be a greater unification and relationship with us for what we experienced together. The fact that we have traveled here together and are enjoying this together, there's a bond that grows from that. But if it came to a point that any of us, if not all of us, were in danger in any capacity, we would unify unlike any other scenario. Maybe the storm was God's greatest gift to them for what they would be called to do later down the road. You have no idea what the proper time is, and you have no idea why the Lord allows a storm to come your way. But by God's grace, you're going to get through this. I've got one more point for you. When you're out on the water, when you're in between A and C, continue to worship and row. Just continue to worship and row. One of the things that we see from them is they just simply continued to row. And maybe today your arms are tired, your hands are blistered, but I would encourage you, brother in the Lord, sister in the Lord, continue to worship, continue to row. Be strong in the grace of God, because by God's grace, you're going to get through this. By God's grace, you're going to get through this. Will you say that with me today? By God's grace, I'll make it through this. By God's grace, I'll make it through this. There back home, you've said that with us multiple times today. I want you to bow your head and I want you to pray that with me today. In this moment of prayer back home, I want you to say that right there. Just maybe in a whisper. By God's grace, I'll make it through this. By God's grace, I'll make it through this. Father, we thank you so much for this time. We thank you for your grace that carries us. Jesus, we adore you. We absolutely adore you. And Lord, today, if there's anyone here in Israel on this trip, or anyone back home in Tampa that feels like they're in the middle of the sea fighting the storm, I pray they would be reminded, not just in their ears, but in the depths of their soul, that by your grace they're going to get through this, that your presence is with them, and that you'll strengthen them. God, I ask that you carry them. Back home, I want you to maintain just kind of an environment and an attitude of worship right now. I'm going to invite the band back onto the stage. They're going to be leading you in a song in just a moment. And I want you to use this song back home as an opportunity to pour out your heart. Not so much to pour out your situation, not so much to try and inform the Lord of where you are and that you're struggling at the oars and that you're out at sea and how long you've been there. Back home, I want you just to take this next couple of moments, make it a holy moment to worship the Lord for who he is, that by his grace, he's going to carry you through this. He is going to see you to the other side. Bridgeway, I love you so much. We're praying for you just as much as you're praying for us. Use this moment, absorb this moment. Make the next few minutes as we sign off, make it a holy moment. Worship the Lord, for he is worthy to be praised. God bless you. We love you. We'll see you soon.